Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched The Northman from 2022. Oh boy, The Northman. Northman, it's A-N, so you pick your pronunciation. This is an interesting film, and one in a sorta kinda series I'm doing of historical dramas. They seem to be picking up in their popularity as of late, possibly as a new reach for a different kind of escapism that we all need right now. This is an interesting one that has a lot more context around it after watching it that makes me think of it slightly differently. But let me start with what I didn't know until just a few minutes ago when reading a little bit about it, is that this movie is based on the story of Amleth, which is a story out of a book written by a 12th century Danish historian, and is pretty firmly believed to be the origin of Shakespeare's Hamlet. It's right there in the name. I didn't recognize that as a parallel, but as soon as you say them next to each other, it seems incredibly obvious. And while it's not, that's not to, I don't want to say that this diverges dramatically from the Hamlet that most people know. It has its parallels and it has substantial differences. I'm also not familiar with the original story and how well this movie follows the original legend as written in the 12th century book. So, that is some interesting historical context for things I want to talk about. The movie is co-written and directed by Robert Eggers, who is a filmmaker that I don't have a lot of familiarity with, but who I've always been curious about. I've had his work recommended to me by people who know my tastes, and he basically only has two other films: The Witch, the Vivitch, that one, and The Lighthouse. And both of them have been on my to-watch list for a while now. And I actually didn't know that he did this movie until... or I saw advertisements for this film before I knew he did it. Now, the movie is visually striking, and if there's one thing I can say about what little bits and pieces I've seen of The Witch and The Lighthouse, is that they are visually striking movies. The Lighthouse is probably more striking than The Witch, but they are, I think in my mind, even only looking at brief clips or screenshots, indicators of somebody who has a good artistic eye for what can be done with the camera and how you can paint with the camera in with a really good understanding of framing and lighting and color and all these other things that are often sort of secondary in what is otherwise a visual medium. So I've been curious for a while, and I figured if there was going to be one for me to check out first, I might as well go with this one. It was alleged to be, it has a much higher budget than his other films, and it was alleged to be sort of more pop friendly. How do I want to phrase that? More made for general audiences. But it still had enough visually appealing things in it that I wanted to see sort of like let's see what he does when he makes something that's a little bit more for the common viewer. Because part of the reason I haven't watched those other two films is because that they are intimidating. I think as cinema, they are kind of weird, very weird, art house, low budget, small scale things that like are exactly the kind of thing I feel like I need to prepare myself or be in the right mindset for before watching. So I figured let's see what this one is like first. Casting wise, there's a pretty great cast here. Certainly a lot of notable but probably relatively small names. I think the most known of the actors are going to be Nicole Kidman and Willem Dafoe. I think anyone who watches movies probably recognizes them. But it also has Alexander Skarsgård, Anya Taylor-Joy, who I talked about during the Thoroughbreds thing, Ethan Hawke, and Claes Bang, I may be butchering his name, who has had a lot of smaller roles in things, but who I like quite a lot. Generally speaking, I think the casting is quite good. I think Nicole Kidman stands out a little bit as being too pretty for the scenes she's supposed to be in. And that gets into a consistency issue throughout the whole film as far as like, is this supposed to be dirty or not? It struck me in particular that Nicole Kidman probably said, or somebody on Nicole Kidman's behalf said, we're not gonna dirty her up, we're not gonna rough her up, or she's gonna have makeup on the whole time, her hair is gonna look nice the whole time, so on and so forth. And so she does sort of stand out, for better or for worse, inarguably for worse. But whether that's actually how much my sort of moderate feelings on her overall performance are influenced by that, I can't particularly say. Her performance is fine, but it was slightly bothersome to see that. Everyone else, I think, puts on moderate to really good performances. Willem Dafoe stands out. He always stands out. He's a scene stealer. Even in the very first scene he's in, you don't know it's him visually, but you hear his voice. And if you know Willem Dafoe's voice, you'll know he's there. And he just absolutely steals every scene he's in, I think. He's the kind of guy I feel like was made for a film like this, and seeing as he was also in The Lighthouse, I think it's no surprise that someone like Robert Eggers, who likes to do the kind of work he likes to do, picks out somebody like Willem Dafoe, who has the acting chops and the kind of expressive face and the like physical talent to mold himself into so many different things. So he sticks out in particular as really, really excellent. Weirdly, Bjork is also in the movie very briefly, but she is there. That's neither here nor there. Bjork is a weird person who just shows up for random things, and is like, "Hi, I'm Bjork," and you're like, "Fuck yeah, you are." If that doesn't make sense to you, don't worry about it. If it does make sense to you, you'll get it. Anyway, I digress. Casting pretty good, acting pretty good. The whole thing is set in the 850s in sort of a particular era of Nordic conquest. My knowledge of Nordic history is limited, so you'll have to forgive me for that. And the movie is spread over a couple of different areas of Europe, and so there you do get some visual variety. But even if you didn't, I think it's worth noting just how spectacular the visuals are throughout this film. And initially, not to bury the lead, but I was completely wowed by the visuals and really, really excited for the rest of the film as a result. The first third to half of the film in particular is not only are the visual compositions really incredible, the use of light and framing and all these other things that go into, the basics of cinematography are really, really excellent and make for a really visually compelling scene. But there are some incredible camera work. There's some incredible camera work being done that I genuinely don't know how they did a whole bunch of stuff. Because the camera makes moves that shouldn't be possible. And I don't know how much of it is editing tricks, and I don't know how much of it is just some really smart and interesting use of technology. And so there are a bunch of shots, including some very long shots, that use some both like impressive camera movements that if you're not like me and you're not looking out for, you might just sort of be like, oh, this is a nice shot. But like, I can't get the bug out of my head of thinking about how they produced certain things, and to see like this camera is all over the place and I don't know how that's possible. I was really, really impressed. This is another film that has some really, really long shots in it as well, like minutes long, that are impeccably composed, and they do not feel like they are there just for the flashiness of it. I think they're there in part because, practically speaking, it was just as easy to do them in a long shot as it was in a series of short shots. And it is infinitely more visually compelling as a result. Now, the choreography has some problems. Not problems. The choreography is interesting. This film wavers between being very sort of actiony and very sort of close and dramatic and intimate. And there are a lot of the combat is, for want of a better phrase, very choreographed. It is obvious that the moves and everything that was done is like deliberate. There's the chaos level is very controlled, and I'm not bothered by that, mostly because it is used really well to it's used well with the camera is a really bad way of putting that. The kind of work that's being done with the camera insists on really specific choreography, and I think the two feed into each other in a way that is it's just a really nice synthesis. It also adds to a sort of tone that permeates the film, which is there are a lot of elements of the film that are supernatural in a sense, or dreamlike in another. And I think there's a through line throughout the film of how much of this is real, how much of it is sort of imagined or a dream, or how much of it is purely for the sake of we're telling the story rather than trying to make this like historically accurate. In the same way that like a lot of mythology tends to care not so much for its own internal consistency or for plot holes or things like that. A lot of the like overall pacing and composition really relies on your willingness to go along for the supernatural presentation and the kind of story that it wants to tell, rather than, you know, seeing the everyday, seeing every scene and every every consistency between, you know, it's not presenting it as pure realism, is what I'm trying to say, rather poorly. However, the story itself, I have some issues with, and it feeds into other issues. Ultimately, I think the film is worth watching because it is visually pretty spectacular, and as a production, it's really nice. But the overall arc of the story is very simple. And so when you have a simple story, a lot of the depth, assuming you're trying to tell some level of depth into your simple story, you have to have some character development and some like character arcs and these sorts of things to tell a meta-narrative. And in some ways, I think this film is trying to tell it's sort of a commentary on a bunch of like deeply psychological and philosophical questions, sort of recontextualizing mythology, both you know, ancient mythology and personal mythologies, the things we tell ourselves and we tell our children and our parents tell us, and how those things are related to generational traumas and cycles of toxicity and all these other things. And it feels like it's trying to tell more of that secondary story, but the second half of the film really struggles because it can't seem to commit to that. I don't know if this is a matter of trying to recontextualize the original story without modifying the story too much, or if it's just a matter of the storytelling style not being willing to commit to its idea, or if it's entirely accidental. It's quite possible that what I'm reading into it is entirely accidental. The story frames Amleth, the main character, as it frames the initial framing is that of sort of heroic revenge, but the reality of his story as it goes through, certainly the first probably half to 2/3 of the story, does paint him as simultaneously like this imposing heroic figure and yet also kind of pathetic, where his own motivations are subtly undercut by the story that's being told. And how do I put this? He has moments where he presents himself as the hero because he believes himself to be the hero. And unfortunately, the film doesn't seem to commit to the tragedy of that. it's an interesting contrast now thinking about it, comparing it to Hamlet, where Hamlet is a deeply tragic character, but he's also a deeply comic character. And the patheticness of his own beliefs and where they come from is kind of intrinsically tied to why he's compelling as a character. Comparatively speaking, in this film, Amleth neither seems to learn his lesson and have a change of view in his arc based on the information that he learns, nor does he have the tragic nor does he have like the truly tragic charge where you see him commit to something that he and the viewer know are a mistake, but the world around him or the context of his work means that you pity him. In some ways, the classic tragedy is a pitiable mistake, basically. And unfortunately, at the end of the film, the last third maybe doesn't seem to still seems to frame him heroically, even though the story itself seems to be telling us he isn't heroic. And so there's this sort of tonal mismatch that happens by the end. And unfortunately, that also feeds into visual and editing problems, where either the visuals don't match the tone of the story that seems to be on screen, where visually it says it's heroic, but emotionally it says it's pathetic. And the final sequences really don't have the emotional weight I think the movie wants them to have, because it's undercut by this mismatch of tones. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about this film, and I've been going back and forth on it for about the last hour. It's not a bad film by any means, but it is unsatisfying. I wouldn't want this to turn into some, mid-2000s, like heroic sacrifice film. There's a lot of parallels to like things like Gladiator. And I wouldn't want it to turn into that, because that would be hokey, especially with the sort of art house through line that this has. But I also I don't think I would want it to give up the subtlety and go full tragic, either Shakespearean tragedy or like Greek tragedy, because I think that would also sort of undercut the subtleties that I see as a success in the first half of the film and a failure in the second half. There's a lot else to compliment this film on that I'm sort of leaving out, and I could get bogged down in it, but I don't think it's necessarily worth it. In addition to all the incredible visuals, I think there's a lot of really good audio work, but it also degrades with the length of the film. And actually, some of the worst part is the occasional use of CGI. There's some CGI that's really good and some CGI that's really bad. And I can't figure out why, because it's used very sparingly. As I understand it, this had some production problems. That doesn't surprise me, given that, this was Robert Eggers' first really like higher budget film. That there was some fighting with the studio, and it sounds like he has no plans to do this again, that he's going to go back to be making exclusively small things. But I do wonder if there is a lost director's cut of this film that is substantially better. I did see one note somewhere that Apparently, in the initial test audiences, the test audiences said first the first portion of the film was too slow, and that is a red flag for me because, well, it may have gotten more editing after that, but I think the slowness of the pacing in the first third to half is one of its great strengths. Still, I wonder what might have been if this had gotten its full director's vision edit. It is the kind of, borderline auteur production that feels like it would immediately fall apart given too much meddling. And while my feelings on that and my thoughts on it are completely speculative, I don't know. I wonder what might be out there, and I wonder what the original version might have had. I think it's a pretty spectacular production, and unfortunately, I think it just has some problems in its overall composition. And I don't think I can say that I love this film, and I don't think I can say I can dislike it. I particularly dislike it either. But it did leave me kind of going, that's the noise. That's the noise. Yeah, that's the noise I make for this film. Still, if you're a fan of his other two films, I think it's worth seeing. And if you're a fan of just seeing some really good cinematography, I think it's worth it as well. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.